The green lights on Kethera's communication panel flickered and died, one by one. Each light had represented a colony world in the Zephyrian collective. Now, they were going dark, one after another, like stars being snuffed out across the galaxy. He pressed his six-fingered hand against the smooth surface of his desk and tried to stay calm. The reports coming through the emergency channels were all the same. People were getting sick with something no one understood. It started with small things, forgetting words, losing track of conversations, staring blankly at familiar faces. Within days, the victims could not speak. Within weeks, they could not think. The other scholars called it the silence, because that was what it left behind, empty minds in living bodies. Entire cities full of people who had simply stopped being people, even though their hearts still beat and their lungs still breathed. Kethera pulled up the medical files on his screen. The pictures made his stomach turn. Zephyrians wandering through their crystal cities like lost children. Valorians, whose transparent bodies once glowed with brilliant thoughts, now dim and colorless. The machine hybrid Nexari, their perfect, cybernetic minds reduced to blank stares and mechanical repetition. A soft chime told him the Galactic Council was calling an emergency session. Kethera activated his transport pad and felt the familiar tingle as his body dissolved and reformed in the great assembly chamber. The chamber was enormous, with seats for representatives from over 1,000 different worlds. Today, it felt smaller somehow. Fear had a way of making even the biggest spaces feel cramped and airless. Ambassador. The Xandra of the hegemony worlds was already speaking when Kethera materialized. Her voice boomed through the translation systems, reaching every corner of the chamber. The contamination spreads faster than we can track it, she was saying. Her forearms gestured at the massive holographic display floating above the assembly. Red zones marked the infected areas, and they were growing larger every hour. We have lost contact with 17 star systems in the past week alone. A Valorian representative, her crystalline body flickering with nervous energy, stood up from her seat. Our scientists believe the disease travels through subspace communications. Every time we try to help the infected worlds, we risk spreading it further. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. Kethera felt his heart sink as he listened. To his fellow representatives, they were not talking about helping the sick worlds. They were talking about cutting them off completely. We must establish a quarantine perimeter, announced the Nexari delegate, his mechanical voice cutting through the chatter. Calculate acceptable losses, preserve the greater population. Logic demands sacrifice of the few for the many. More voices joined in, each one agreeing with the cold mathematics of survival. The ancient Valorians, who had existed for millions of years, voted to seal their borders immediately. The proud hegemony worlds followed suit, declaring any ship from infected systems would be destroyed on sight. Kethera watched in horror as civilization, after civilization, turned its back on the plague victims. He thought of his cousin Valandra, trapped on one of the dying colony worlds. She had sent a message 3 days ago, begging for medical supplies. The message had been garbled, her words confused and frightened. There would be no more messages. Now, the voting continued around the chamber. Every species chose the same thing: safety for themselves, abandonment for the infected. Entire star systems were being written off, like damaged equipment, too costly to repair. The decision is made, declared Ambassador Thexandra. All contact with infected zones is forbidden. Any vessel attempting to breach the quarantine will be considered a threat to galactic security. The chamber began to empty as representatives hurried back to their worlds to begin the isolation protocols. Kethera sat frozen in his seat, staring at the red zones on the display. Billions of sentient beings, left to die alone while the galaxy built walls around them, in the far corner of the chamber. He noticed a small group that had not moved. They wore simple uniforms and sat in the newest section of the assembly, the area reserved for species that had joined the galactic community within the last few centuries. One of them stood up slowly. He was tall and pale, with the soft features that marked him as human. Ambassador Kim Min-ho had only been representing his species for a few months. Most of the older civilizations barely acknowledged the humans existed. "We volunteer to help," Kim Min-ho said quietly. The chamber fell silent. Then, slowly, laughter began to echo through the space. Not joyful laughter, but the harsh sound people make when they hear something impossibly foolish. "The humans want to help," wheezed a hegemony delegate. "With what?" "Their primitive ships and Stone Age medicine. They have been in space for less than 200 years, added a Valorian. "They do not understand the risks." But Kim Min-ho did not sit down. He stood there calmly, while the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy laughed at his offer. When the laughter finally died down, he spoke again. "We understand the risks," he said. "We also understand that people are dying while we argue about safety." Cathera felt something stir in his chest that he had not felt since the crisis began. It was small and fragile, but it was their hope. The humans, dismissed and mocked by every other species in the chamber, were the only ones willing to fly into the darkness where the rest of the galaxy feared to go. Dr. Park Ji-won pressed her face against the small window of the human medical ship and watched the dark planet below. 3 months ago, the world had been home to 50 million Zephyrians. Now, it was silent, except for the weak distress signals that played the same message over and over. "Help us, help us, help us." "Still think we're crazy for coming here," said Lee Hun-woo from the pilot's seat. He was young for a xenobiologist, barely 30, but he had volunteered immediately when the call went out. Every other species in the galaxy ran away from this place. Through the ship's communication system, they could hear the automated warnings that other civilizations had left behind. "Stay away from infected zones. Do not land on quarantined worlds. Risk of contamination too high." The Valorians had left massive warning beacons that flashed red light into space. The Nexari had programmed hunter drones to patrol the system borders. Dr. Park turned away from the window and looked at her team. There were 12 humans on the ship, all volunteers. They had basic medical equipment, simple translation devices, and food supplies for 6 months, compared to the advanced technology that other species used. Their gear looked like toys. Dr. Song My-rae sat at a small table, working on something she called communication boards. She was the team's psychologist, a quiet woman who had spent her whole career studying how different species thought and felt. The boards were covered with simple pictures, happy faces, sad faces, basic shapes and colors that might mean something to alien minds. "The other species tried to treat this like a normal disease," she said without looking up from her work. "They built isolation chambers and used machines to study the victims. But what if that made things worse? What if being alone is part of what kills them?" Captain Cho, Junho, the mission commander, floated over to join the conversation. He was a veteran of the First Contact Wars, scarred and serious, but he had the gentlest hands when dealing with frightened civilians. "The Galactic Council thinks we're throwing our lives away. Maybe they're right. Maybe," Dr. Park agreed, "but someone has to try." The ship shuddered as they entered the planet's atmosphere. Through the window, Dr. Park could see the Zephyrian cities below. They had been built from living crystal that grew into beautiful towers and bridges. Now the crystal was dim and gray, like flowers that had forgotten how to bloom. They landed near what had once been the planet's capital. The spaceport was full of abandoned ships, Valorian science vessels, Nexori medical drones, hegemony rescue craft, all empty now, left behind when their crews fled. The humans put on their simple environment suits and stepped out into the alien air. The city stretched out before them, silent and still. But as they walked toward the main settlement, they began to see movement. Zephyrians wandered through the streets like their tall, graceful bodies moved without purpose, bumping into walls and each other. Some sat in doorways, staring at nothing. Others walked in endless circles, their faces blank and confused. Dr. Park approached the first group carefully. In her hands, she carried one of Dr. Song's communication boards and a small medical scanner. The Zephyrians looked at her with empty eyes, but they did not run away. "Hello?" she said softly, showing them the board with a simple picture of two figures shaking hands. "We are here to help." One of the Zephyrians, a female with intricate markings on her blue-gray skin, reached out and touched the picture. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, not understanding exactly, but recognition that someone was trying to communicate. Behind Dr. Park, Lee Hunwoo was setting up his scanning equipment. The readings were unlike anything in the medical databases. The plague was not attacking the Zephyrians' bodies, it was attacking their minds, destroying the neural pathways that allowed for language, memory, and abstract thought. "It's like their brains are being rewired," he reported, through the team communication system. "But the damage isn't random. It's targeting specific areas, the parts that handle communication and social connection." Dr. Song knelt down next to a young Zephyrian who sat motionless on the ground. She showed him pictures from her board: food, water, safety. The young alien did not respond at first, but when she gently placed her hand on his shoulder, he looked up at her. "Physical contact," she whispered into her communicator. "They still respond to touch. That's something the automated systems couldn't provide." As the human team worked through the settlement, they discovered something that the earlier rescue attempts had missed. The Zephyrians who were completely alone showed the worst symptoms, but those who had stayed together in small groups were doing slightly better. They could not speak or think clearly, but they still seemed to recognize that other beings existed. By the end of the first day, the humans had established a small medical station in the center of the settlement. It was nothing like the high-tech facilities that other species had tried to build, just simple shelters, basic equipment, and humans willing to sit with the victims for hours at a time. That night, as Dr. Park reviewed the day's notes, she made an entry that would change how the galaxy understood the plague. "The disease may feed on isolation. Victims who maintain any form of social contact show slower deterioration. Automated care systems may have made the problem worse by removing the human element, or in this case, the sentient element." Outside their shelter, the sounds of the dying city continued. But for the first time since the plague began, those sounds included something new: the quiet voices of humans refusing to give up on people. The rest of the galaxy had already forgotten. The Zephyrian settlement looked like a graveyard where the dead still walked. Dr. Park stepped carefully around the bodies of aliens who had collapsed in the streets. Some were still breathing, but their eyes were empty. Others sat against walls, moving their lips without making any sound, as if they were trying to remember how to speak. The advanced medical facility at the center of the city stood dark and silent. The Valorian doctors had abandoned it weeks ago, leaving behind millions of credits worth of scanning equipment and healing machines, all useless now. The automated systems had run perfectly programmed treatments on every victim, and every victim had gotten worse. Dr. Song Murray crouched next to an elderly Zephyrian female who was rocking back and forth on the ground. The alien's 6 arms moved in strange patterns, like she was trying to write invisible words in the air. Dr. Song had been watching her for 3 hours, trying to understand what the movements meant. "Look at this," she called to Lee Hunwoo. "She keeps making the same gestures. I think she's trying to tell us something, but she can't remember how." Lee looked up from his portable scanner. The readings were confusing him more each day. "The plague isn't destroying their brains randomly," he said. "It's like it knows exactly which parts to attack. Language centers, memory formation, abstract, thinking, all the things that make someone a person, instead of just a body." Captain Cho Jun-ho had turned one of the abandoned buildings into a makeshift hospital. It had no fancy equipment, just beds made from local materials and simple medical supplies the humans had brought with them. But something strange was happening there. The Zephyrians who stayed in the human-run facility were not getting worse as quickly as the others. Nurse Jo Yuna had figured out how to communicate with the crystal-bodied Valorians who had been trapped on the planet when the pack evacuation happened. The Valorians thought in colors, and their transparent bodies showed their emotions as shifting patterns of light. Jo had strung together colored lights from their emergency supplies, creating simple patterns that seemed to calm the sick aliens. The blue-green combination means safety in their culture, she explained to Dr. Park, and the warm yellow pulses seem to represent companionship. When I show them these patterns, their vital signs improve. Dr. Park made notes on her tablet. Every day brought new discoveries about how to care for plague victims. But they were discoveries born from desperation rather than science. The humans had no choice but to try everything, no matter how simple or strange it seemed. Choi Sunho, their lead researcher, had been working with a group of young Zephyrians who showed less severe symptoms. He had given them paper and drawing supplies, hoping they could express what they could no longer say with words. The pictures they drew were disturbing, dark shapes surrounding small figures, walls closing in, empty spaces where other people should be. They're drawing loneliness, he reported during the evening briefing. Every picture is about being alone, being cut off from others. What if that's not just a symptom of the plague? What if it's part of how the plague works? Dr. Park looked around at her team. They had been on the planet for 2 weeks now, and the stress was showing on all of them. They were exhausted, scared, and working with equipment that most galactic civilizations would consider primitive. But they were also seeing things that the advanced medical teams had missed. The automated systems treated each patient individually, she said slowly. Separate rooms, sterile environments, no contact with other victims. What if that made them worse? Lee nodded eagerly. The brain scans show the most damage in areas associated with social bonding and community connection. Maybe the plague feeds on isolation. That night, Dr. Park made a decision that would have horrified the medical boards on any civilized world. Instead of keeping the plague victims separated, she moved them into group settings. Zephyrians were placed together in communal areas. Valorians were given spaces where their light patterns could interact with each other. Even the machine hybrid Nexori were grouped with their own kind. The results were immediate. Victims who had been getting steadily worse began to stabilize. Some even showed small improvements, a word spoken clearly, a moment of recognition, a gesture that actually meant something. Dr. Song spent her days developing new ways for the victims to connect with each other and with their human caregivers. She created touch-based communication systems for species that used physical contact. She organized simple group activities that required no language, sharing meals, working on basic tasks together, just sitting in the same space. It's working, she reported to the Galactic Council through their emergency communication channel. The patients who have social contact are showing 50% slower deterioration rates than those in isolation. The response from the council was immediate and angry. You are violating every quarantine protocol, came the reply from Ambassador Thesandra. You are risking the spread of contamination across species lines. But the humans did not stop. They continued their primitive, desperate experiments in connection and community. They held hands with dying aliens. They sang to patients who could no longer understand words. They refused to let anyone face the plague alone, even when the rest of the galaxy had given up on them. In his final report of the day, Lee Hunwoo wrote something that would eventually change galactic medicine forever. The plague may not be a traditional disease. It appears to be a weapon that attacks the neural foundations of social behavior. The cure may not be medical. It may be emotional. Outside the human-run facility, the sounds of the dying city continued. But inside, for the first time since the plague began, there were also sounds of hope. The laboratory aboard the human ship Compassion was nothing like the sterile research facilities of the advanced civilizations. Cables snaked across the floor between simple computers. Dr. Park had jury-rigged scanning equipment from spare parts, and the whole space smelled like the instant coffee that kept the research team awake. Through endless nights of work, Cathera sat at a small table in the center of the chaos, slowly placing colored tiles in patterns on a board. 3 weeks ago, he had been one of the worst plague victims on the planet, unable to speak, barely able to recognize faces, lost in the fog that had consumed his mind. Now, thanks to the constant care of the human team, he could think clearly, 4 hours at a time. The patterns, he said carefully, his voice still weak from weeks of silence. I remember now. The plague came with the patterns. Dr. Kim Taeyeon, the team's neurologist, leaned forward with interest. He had been studying brain scans from dozens of different species, trying to understand how the same disease could affect such different types of minds. What kind of patterns, Cathera? Cathera arranged the tiles to show interlocking spirals. In our communication networks, beautiful mathematical sequences that appeared in our data streams. We thought they were natural phenomena, cosmic background radiation, forming interesting shapes. But they were not natural. They were a message. Lee Hunwoo looked up from his genetic sequencer, excitement clear on his face. A message that carried the plague. More than that, Cathera whispered. A message that was the plague. It attacked our minds through our own communication systems. It told us we were alone. It made us believe that no one cared if we lived or died. Dr. Park felt the pieces clicking together in her mind. That's why isolation made the symptoms worse. The plague doesn't just attack neural pathways randomly. It targets the parts of the brain that handle social connection and hope. Dr. Song entered the laboratory, carrying a thick folder of drawings and notes. She had been working with plague victims from 6 different species, developing communication methods for beings who had lost the ability to speak. I've been documenting the progression, she said. In every case, the first symptom is the same. The victim becomes convinced that they have been abandoned by their community, even when they haven't been. Asked Dr. Kim, especially when they haven't been. The Valorians I've been treating keep trying to tell me that their light have been cut off from their collective consciousness. But when I test them, the connections are still there. The plague makes them believe they're alone, even when they're surrounded by their own people. Cathera nodded slowly. Yes, that is exactly what happened to me. I felt like I was floating in empty space, with no one to hear my thoughts. Even when my family was standing right next to me, I could not feel their presence. The breakthrough came when Dr. Kim compared brain scans from plague victims, who were recovering under human care, with scans from victims who had received only automated treatment. The difference was dramatic. Look at this, he said, projecting the images onto the lab's main screen. Victims treated by machines show massive damage to the neural clusters that process emotional connection and social bonding, but victims treated by humans show activity in those same areas, like the connections are being rebuilt. Because we don't abandon them, Dr. Park said quietly. We sit with them for hours. We touch them. We show them that someone cares whether they live or die. Lee was running calculations on his computer, his fingers flying over the keyboard. The plague is like a psychological virus. It spreads through communication networks, but what it really spreads is despair. It makes victims believe they are worthless and alone. Once they believe that completely, their brains start shutting down. So the cure isn't medical, Dr. Song concluded. It's emotional. We have to prove to the victims that they are not alone, that someone values them enough to stay with them no matter what. Dr. Park thought about all the civilizations that had fled from the plague zones. The Valorians, with their ancient wisdom. The Nexari, with their perfect logic. The hegemony worlds, with their advanced technology. All of them had responded to the plague with the one thing that made it stronger: abandonment. We need to contact the Galactic Council, she said, not to ask for help, but to tell them what we've learned. Captain Cho activated the communication array. Within minutes, They were connected to the emergency session that had been running continuously since the plague began. Ambassador Tex Hondra appeared on the screen, her forearms crossed in annoyance. Dr. Park, you were ordered to maintain quarantine. Your reckless experiments have put the entire galaxy at risk. Ambassador, Dr. Park replied calmly, we have found the cure. The chamber fell silent. Representatives from 1,000 worlds leaned forward to hear what the primitive humans had discovered, that all their advanced science had missed. The plague feeds on despair and isolation, Dr. Park explained. It is defeated by hope and connection. Every victim who recovers does so because someone refused to abandon them. The cure is not a medicine or a machine, it is the knowledge that someone cares. Behind her, Kethera stood up slowly. His voice carried across the communication channel to every world in the galaxy. They saved us not with technology, but with kindness. While you all ran away, the humans stayed. They held our hands while we died, and that is why we lived. In the silence that followed, the galaxy began to understand that sometimes the most advanced solution is also the most simple one. The Grand Assembly Hall had never been so quiet. Representatives from civilizations across the galaxy sat in stunned silence as the final statistics scrolled across the massive display screens. Recovery rates in human-managed facilities, 7%. Recovery rates in automated facilities, 0%. Species saved from complete extinction, 40-7.keth. Single quotes Era stood at the speaker's podium, his tall frame steady and strong. The neural implant that translated his thoughts into galactic standard hummed softly as he prepared to address the assembly. 6 months ago, he had been dying in the streets of his home world, his mind eaten away by the plague that the galaxy's greatest scientists could not understand. I speak for the dead worlds that are now alive, he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber, for the Zephyrian colonies that were written off as lost causes, for the Valorian crystal cities that had gone dark, for the 47 species that you abandoned to die alone. In the human section of the assembly, Dr. Park sat quietly with her team. They wore simple uniforms, not the elaborate ceremonial robes of the older civilizations. Captain Cho had a new scar across his cheek from their work on the machine world of Nexus Prime. Nurse Jo Yuna's hands were still stained blue from treating Valorian plague victims. They looked tired and worn, these humans who had spent months flying into quarantine zones that everyone else feared to approach. Ambassador Thexandra shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The hegemony worlds had been among the first to seal their borders, among the loudest voices calling for complete isolation of infected systems. Now she had to face the consequences of that choice. The humans, Kethera continued, arrived at our world with medical equipment that our children would have laughed at. Their computers were slower than our calculators. Their ships were held together with spare parts and hope, but they brought something that all of our advanced technology could not provide. They brought the promise that no one would die alone. Dr. Song rose from her seat and walked to the data terminal. The psychological profiles she had compiled over months of work appeared on the screens around the chamber. Plague victims who had been cared for by sentient beings showed completely different brain patterns than those treated only by machines. The plague was not just a disease, she explained to the assembly. It was a weapon designed to attack our capacity for hope and connection. Every automated system, every quarantine protocol, every decision to abandon infected worlds made the plague stronger. A young Valorian representative, her crystalline body glowing with embarrassment, stood to speak. My people have existed for 3 million years. We have seen the rise and fall of 1,000 civilizations, but we learned nothing of true wisdom until a species barely 2 centuries old showed us what it meant to refuse to abandon others. Murmurs rippled through the assembly. The ancient species were not used to admitting they had been wrong, especially not two beings they had dismissed as primitive newcomers. Ambassador Kim Minho finally stood up from the human delegation. His voice was quiet, but clear as he addressed the thousands of representatives. We did not help because we were braver than you. We did not help because we were smarter than you. We helped because when we saw people suffering, we could not walk away. But at what cost? Demanded a Nexari delegate, his mechanical voice cutting through the chamber. You risked spreading the plague to every world you visited. You broke every quarantine protocol. You could have destroyed the entire galaxy. Could have, agreed Captain Cho, standing to join his ambassador, but we did not. Because we learned something that your protocols never taught. Sometimes the biggest risk is doing nothing at all. Dr. Kim presented the final piece of evidence that would reshape galactic civilization. The plague still exists, he announced. It lives in the communication networks, waiting for the next time a civilization decides that some of its people are not worth saving. It feeds on abandonment and despair. The only permanent cure is to ensure that no one is ever abandoned again. The implications hit the assembly like a physical blow. The plague was not gone, it was dormant, waiting for the next great crisis that would divide the galaxy into those worth saving and those worth sacrificing. Cathara returned to the podium for his final words. Today we vote on a new charter for the Galactic Council, not based on technological advancement or military might, but on a simple principle that every sentient being has value and none shall be abandoned. The vote was not even close. World after world stood to pledge their support for the new charter. The species that had once mocked humanity's primitive technology now competed to work alongside human medical teams. The Valorians offered to share their most advanced healing techniques. The Nexari opened their industrial worlds to produce the simple, reliable equipment that human doctors preferred. As the assembly dispersed, Ambassador Kim found himself surrounded by representatives from dozens of civilizations, all asking the same questions. How do we learn to care the way humans care? How do we build hope instead of just technology? Kim smiled and gestured toward his team, the doctors and nurses and researchers who had flown into the darkness when everyone else fled toward the light. You start by deciding that no one is expendable. Everything else follows from that. Outside the assembly hall, construction crews were already beginning work on the new Galactic Medical Center. It would be run jointly by all species, but built on principles that humanity had taught the galaxy, that healing required more than medicine, that survival required more than technology, and that civilization itself depended on the simple promise that no one would face their darkest hour alone. The youngest species in the galaxy had become its teachers, and the galaxy was finally ready to learn.